of it. I mean, it's a good job we hadn't heard of it because there's been so much paranoia.
On December 9th, 1980, Harrison, the Beatles' guitarist, was sound asleep at his country home in England when his wife Olivia took a call from Harrison's sister Louise in New York. She had learned via the news that Harrison's fellow Beatle, John Lennon, had been shot in the Manhattan emergency room of St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital and had since died. Harrison did not even realize that his bandmate had just been slain as he turned over and fell back asleep. He wasn't the only Beatles member behaving weirdly in the midst of sorrow. When asked about John Lennon's murder by a television reporter, Paul McCartney described it as a drag. But Harrison's behavior was not atypical, as Philip Norman points out in George Harrison, the Reluctant Beatle. Scribner. Rather, it was the worst expression of his tactless gene. Critically speaking, Norman argues that it was also a product of years spent under the shadow of Paul McCartney and John Lennon, the Beatles' principal songwriters. Shortly after waking, Harrison gave a more somber remark on Lennon's death. "I'm amazed and in shock. Stealing life itself is the biggest crime there is." Harrison's response to Lennon's death happened at a time when the two were not together. During the Beatles' tenure, their relationship had seldom been pleasant, in part because Harrison needed creative freedom and Lennon and McCartney refused to grant it. It was actually only their LSD adventures that united Harrison and Lennon. Norman claimed that Harrison was impacted by the chemical right away. But once the Beatles came clean, the animosity between Lennon and Harrison returned, particularly because Lennon's new partner, Yoko Ono, began to sap what little love Lennon still harbored for Harrison. Despite having hits in the late 1960s, such as While My Guitar Gently Weeps and Something, Lennon and McCartney were still superior to Harrison in terms of creativity. Although Harrison made it into the first-class cabin with songs equaling the best, if never the vast quantity, of Lennon and McCartney's, as Norman observes, by sheer dogged persistence, Harrison responded to the slights with humor and dignity, referring to himself as the economy-class Beatle. When they first started playing in German clubs, Lennon assumed leadership of the group, and their strained relationship started. This is not to suggest that genuine camaraderie was non-existent. During the German tour, Lennon, McCartney, and subsequently drummer Pete Best even saw Harrison lose his virginity to a local woman while the band was living in the same room. "When I was done, everybody clapped and cheered. At least they were silent while I was working on it," he clarifies. Harrison, however, was portrayed as a subservient figure in the relationship's predefined model. In fact, Harrison's fight with John Lennon in January 1969 was the final straw that made him decide to quit the Beatles. Producer George Martin, who witnessed the argument grow violent, asserts that the event took place while the band was recording their most recent album, Let It Be. There had only ever been 2 incidents of the Beatles members fighting. However, Harrison saw it as the final straw. Norman says he just said, "Okay, see you around the clubs," and he got into his car to go. When Harrison quit the Beatles, Lennon suggested employing Eric Clapton as a ready-made replacement because he was just as good and not so much of a headache. After peace talks at Ringo Starr's house, Harrison rejoined the Beatles 10 days later, but the end was in sight. Simmering conflicts led to Paul McCartney's decision to leave the Beatles in April 1970, marking the end of their wonderful relationship. Though their friendship persisted, Harrison and Lennon's relationship remained challenging as always.